Are they curating the news in good faith? Or are they doing it as part of a deliberate campaign of gaslighting?
Misinformation is everywhere. It's a massive problem. It's like a problem of our time. We need to fact check. We need to correct.
These kind of decisions about what information to show people on social media platforms, these are not being made by individual producers. These are being made by algorithms. Are we going to get into a world where it becomes impossible to convince anybody that anything is real?
Hey, we're Steve and Andrea from the Political Reality Podcast.
We're so excited you're here. Today, we have a great interview for you with Professor Joshua Tucker. He is the co-director of the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU. And we're going to be talking about misinformation. It feels like it's everywhere. We talk about it all the time. It's certainly a big part of American politics and politics around the world. So we're going to dive in on what it is, what it isn't, how we measure it, and
what to do about it, if anything.
Yeah, and I think some surprising findings and recommendations, not your usual fact check recommendations.
Yeah, I was surprised.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, if you surprise Steve, I think you've really done something. We're super excited to share that with you, our first interview of the podcast. But before we do that, we thought we would dive into a small segment called Data Corner. You ready to get cornered by some data?
Absolutely.
Very good. So, Steve,
yes.
So I have some data that I'd like to run by you.
Okay.
And as your background in the medical profession, I think you may know more about this than many, but these days, prescription drug prices are in the news. Do you know how much more Americans pay on average for prescription drugs compared to, say, other developed countries?
Like European countries?
Yeah.
So on average, I think is the key word there. I know that there's a huge variance because we have drugs that are on patent and generic alternatives. Generic alternatives are pretty cheap. I would say on average, probably 50% more.
So research, and a lot of politicians these days are citing these numbers, but the most recent research that I find reliable comes from Rand Corporation, and it uses 2022 numbers. And according to those numbers, Americans on balance, depending on how you control for prices and whether we have coupons and rebates and those sorts of things, on balance pay between 200 and 300% of what Europeans, so 2 to 3 times as much as Europeans. So that's a lot. And that's a big talking point for the Trump administration. It's a big talking point for the Biden administration. It's one of the few things, actually, that Americans really agree on is drug prices are too high for prescriptions.
So is that the average of the drug price or the average of what people are paying for their total prescription burden?
So it depends. If it's total prescription burden, it can vary, but on balance, the prices are about 3x American prices.
All right.
And that's where the variation comes in. And of course, it's not taking into account the very complicated systems around American healthcare where some of us aren't really paying much because of our insurance and others of us are paying a ton because we don't have insurance. But this average, and I think you hit on this, is the average itself is a bit misleading. So it's not necessarily the case that, saying that Americans pay 3 times more than Europeans for prescription drugs on average makes it sound like every time I go to CVS and fill a prescription, I'm paying 30 and the French people are paying 10.
Yes.
The actual reality is that it depends a lot on drugs. And exactly as you said, generics are really cheap. And do you know if do you think they're cheaper or more expensive in Europe?
Probably, I would say the same or cheaper.
Yeah, so this same research from Rand Corporation finds that American drug prices for generics are 67% the price on average compared to Americans.
That makes sense.
Do you know what percentage, this is trivia night, do you know what percentage of prescriptions filled in the United States are for generics?
No, I've never really thought about that, the percentage. I think I know insurance companies prefer you use generics first. I think physicians who are cost-effective, mindful, know that we could start with the cheap stuff. There's no reason to go right for the super expensive on-patent new drug out there. But we do like to use the new shiny drug that is a little bit better than the older ones, or sometimes it's a lot better. So on balance, I would say maybe it's half.
So I was surprised by the numbers. So they're 90% of prescriptions filled. 90 to 91%. It's a bit of a debated number. And in Europe, it's actually only 40%. So we're actually a lot more generics.
It's not that much of an incentive.
It's not that much of an incentive.
Yeah.
That's right. So what this means is that if drug prices in the US are 3 times higher than in Europe, but our generics, which make up 90% of our prescriptions, are cheaper than in Europe, this leaves us with these shiny brand name drugs that you're describing that cost way, way more in the United States than in Europe.
Right.
And so those percentages, again, it kind of depends on how you measure it, but the brand name originals from this same data set come out at 422% of European prices. So we're paying way more for these expensive, cutting edge drugs. These are drugs that the patent hasn't expired. There's usually many, many patents, and those kind of are in a cascading state of non-expiring. But I did want to call attention to this in our data corner, because when we talk in politics about how it's 3 times the price, that is factually true. But it's also statistically misleading because many, many Americans are paying less than their European counterparts. And a few Americans, of course, these are maybe for rare diseases or for difficult to treat diseases.
Or you've just failed the generic alternatives.
Or you failed the generic alternatives. And so it's not to say that this isn't a problem, but it's a different sort of problem than I think we talk about.
Yeah, I mean, I know drug companies make most of their money off their on-patent drugs. They still make a little bit of money off of generics, but only about 10% of on-patent drugs. So they try to make all their money while for that period of time. And then they're planning their releases so that when that patent is running up, they have a couple of tricks to extend the patent. Like we did a different formulation, or now we have the sustained release. And then they have their next drug in the pipeline to replace it just as it goes off patent. So they're gaming the system that way. But at the other end, again, you have insurance companies, some of which is the government, they're gaming the system too. It's like, nope, you have to try this generic before we'll pay for the on-patent one. And that's reasonable. I say that's perfect. We should do that ourselves so that we're not forced to do it. And that's cost effective too. Because if we don't do that, someone's going to do it for us.
As a physician, did you try to go generic first?
Always. And not just generic first, because this also dovetails with old tried and true first, right? So I would start with a drug that's been out for 50 years, is off patent. Again, the fact that it's dirt cheap, which they often are, means that the patient's more likely to be compliant with it too. So it's an intention to treat kind of thing. It's more compliance, therefore it's more effective. And the patients will appreciate the fact that you're not giving them a drug that's going to cost 100 times as much as an older generic drug. And again, if that fails, you can always work your way up to the new drugs that maybe they will work, but you shouldn't start there.
Right.
Medical students often, they know about the new shiny drug and they're like, oh, we'll start with this. It's great. I heard all this great stuff about it. Yeah, okay, but let's start with, Advil.
Right.
That can, for a lot of people, that works just fine, and you can always work your way up to that. But that has to be taught. Right. And it isn't, I don't think, universally taught or taught enough.
Well, and I think this is probably a full, if not multiple episodes about politics and healthcare and policy and politics and healthcare and politics and health policy in the United States. But for now, I thought it was a nice picture that, averages are helpful and, summarizing central tendencies of a price or a trend, it can be very useful, but it can also leave out a really big part of the picture.
It does leave out a part of the picture, and it's often grossly misleading if all you give is the average, because then those outliers distort the average. It doesn't tell you what the median is.
Right.
What you really want to know sometimes, like what's the typical person paying, not what's the average.
Right.
Like the average American makes a lot of money, but that doesn't really tell you anything about income inequality.
Right. So, Steve, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this as well is that what we just talked about, that it's 3 times the price in the United States compared to Europe, that is not technically misinformation. It's factually correct. We just unpacked it a tiny bit and saw that it can be a little bit misleading, and there's more to it than that. But what we're about to learn from Josh Tucker is going to go even further and say that a lot of the things that we think about when we think of misinformation are not just, this thing that someone said that's wrong. It's often a lot more subtle. It's information that's maybe correct, presented in a different context, or it's information that's fully correct, but we choose not to believe it because of our own biases.
Are you saying there's a lot of misinformation about misinformation?
I think that might be what I'm saying.
All right.
Let's talk to Josh. So we are here with our first ever guest for the Political Reality Podcast. We are very excited to be joined by Joshua Tucker, eminent expert at NYU about social media and misinformation. Josh, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm honored to be the first guest on your podcast.
We are honored that you are our first guest for the podcast. And I think, Steve and I wanted to ask you about misinformation and how we, as researchers, make sense of the royal we, I guess, how you and your team make sense of misinformation. How do you figure out how much is out there? How do you track how it spreads, what it does? But first, I think we should probably define our terms.
Yeah, I guess, what is misinformation? Is it distinct from disinformation? And is it just lying, or is it something else?
Yeah, so those are good. It's good questions, and it's good to start with defining terms. One of the things, Andrea, as you know, as a social scientist, is that sometimes we work with topics that have kind of rigorous technical definitions to them, but they also have definitions. They also have commonly understood definitions in the real world as well, and in the vernacular. And misinformation is certainly in that context. So people use the term. If you hear people using it on television, you hear people using it in the media, people are going to use it in a wide variety of ways. The academic community, I would say, has by and large settled in on a set of definitions. This is not to say that I don't want to speak for everybody, and different people want to use these different ways. But essentially, the way we think about it is misinformation is information that's wrong. So it's factually incorrect information. Where we talk about disinformation, and often we talk about disinformation campaigns, disinformation, when we add that in general in the academic literature, it tends to mean there's an intentionality here. And essentially, it means that you know that the information is wrong. So disinformation is disinformation. It's often, as I said, it's accompanied by campaign or by spread. If you're going to say you're sowing disinformation or you're spreading disinformation, that's because you know that the information is wrong. When we talk about misinformation, we often suspect that people don't know misinformation is wrong or not. So that's the kind of distinction that we're getting at there. Like, now people could know that you could encounter misinformation, you could know it's wrong. But then the question is, are sort of knowingly spread it. Now, to be very clear, this is distinct from another category that we talk a lot about, which is information that's factually correct, but is shared in a manner that has a sort of partisan bias to it. So we talk about like hyper partisanship. So it's useful to think of those kinds of different things that are floating around in the information environment. You've got like people knowingly spreading disinformation. You have people who are exposed to misinformation. They may or may not know if it's correct or not. And then you have this factually correct information, but it's being shared in a way with this kind of hyper partisanness to it. And people sometimes use those interchangeably.
Now, Josh, I've encountered in the technical literature another term that may also have a colloquial meaning, that is different, where people just don't care if the information is true or not. And I've heard that referred to as bullshit. Is that a term in the technical literature?
It's funny. There are a number of academics who are writing things about studying bullshit, but I'm going to stay off of that one for a moment. Right. I'm not sure the technical definition of it in that regard.
Fair enough. It still defies science today. The hyper-partisan information that others would classify as misinformation. So an example of that would be something like there's X percentage of people crossing the U.S.-Mexico border, and that fact is true. There's that number. But the hyper-partisan aspect, am I correct that that's saying like, and therefore it's a problem, or that's why it's dangerous for your kids, or something like that? Is it the descriptor around the misinformation that's the partisan bias?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different ways. You can think about the context. You can think about the way it's being framed. You could say something like, if we were really going to say, like, does this statement have misinformation in it? And we would say, unemployment today hit 5%.
Right.
And that's another sign of the failed incompetence of the Biden administration, that unemployment is so high. Right. You could also say unemployment today hit 5% thanks to the magisterial work of these new economic wizards that are in the Biden administration that have brought it down to such an acceptable level. Right. Both of those would neither of them have misinformation if the unemployment rate has actually hit 5%. And again, getting at the distinction between misinformation and this kind of hyper partisan content, it depends what it is that you're trying to explain and what you think that this may be, what causes you may think this, what causal effects you think this may have. But in some cases, we might, if we're interested in, for example, polarization, we might be just as concerned about hyper partisan rhetoric as we are about misinformation. If we're interested in whether voters have accurate information with which to judge candidates, then we might be much more concerned about actual misinformation than we are about hyperpartisan content. And if we're interested in how it enters the information ecosystem, then we might be really concerned about the difference between people who are knowingly propagating things that they know are false versus people who are inadvertently being exposed to it and sharing it on because it seems like it could be credible, but they don't know if it's true or not.
In terms of the hyperpartisan information, my sense is it doesn't even have to be in the wrong context or surrounded by analysis like this is a sign of brilliance or incompetence. It could just be highly curated. Like, for example, like to use a classic example, if a news program only tells stories of, say, African Americans committing crimes, each individual story is correct. They're not putting it in any context. They're just deliberately cherry picking one slice of reality in order to just create this impression that there's a lot of crime in this community, but not in other communities. So how do you categorize that?
So, Steve, I want to push back on that just a little bit because, yeah, absolutely. This is a big question. And we all the time talk about what news media chooses to report on and, what a podcast chooses to highlight, what an influencer chooses to highlight. Now, these are decisions. But the one thing I would make is the one point I would try to make is that there's no neutral baseline of what news stories you choose to report on, right? Like there's no correct level of news stories to report on. Those of us around our, my age, who grew up with the CBS Evening News with, Walter Cronkite and those kinds of things, there was a period of time where I think there was a fair degree of consensus across the major national news when you had the world of ABC, CBS, and NBC Evening News. Those news would tend to cover the same kinds of stories, for better or for worse, right? In that regard. And people have pushed back on that period of time as only covering a kind of narrow slice of the American experience. But everybody's making decisions about what to cover, right? And so we can absolutely ask if there are partisan implications of what you've chosen to cover. And we can certainly ask for news media whether the news media is portraying itself as objective versus opinionated. And we can get into where these distinctions can be found. But so, yes, you're right that we actually absolutely can make choices about this. And actually, one super interesting thing that we found in our own research about the Russian trolls in 2016 who were interjecting all this content on Twitter is that most of that content was not low quality news. It was actually what we would call correct news. It was mainstream news from mainstream sources. But they were making, these kinds of choices, as you mentioned, about what it was that they were sharing. But I think we have an assumption that when there's a foreign influence campaign, that foreign influence campaign is sharing misinformation. That's not necessarily at all the case.
Yeah, but I agree that it's not unique to any particular outlet. I think everyone does it. Even the if it bleeds, it leads kind of bias where it's sensational. So even if it's not partisan, there's always some bias in who's curating the news for you. That's why I think you need to, as much as you can, do it yourself or get as many different sources as possible. But I think one important distinction is, are they curating the news in good faith? Or are they doing it as part of a deliberate campaign of gaslighting, of trying to distort their audience's view of reality? Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, I think we could probably, if we sat here, we could think about 10 different things we could say that we would think would be the opposite of in good faith, right? And gaslighting your audience is definitely one of the things that's in the opposite of being in good faith. But then I think we get into a world where we are really beginning to think about the overall nature of the attention economy these days, right? And all the different sources of information that are competing for people's attention and all the different ways that decisions are being made about what's included in people's news. Now, on the one hand, as you're saying, there can be a real intentionality to it. If you have a half an hour news program and you're going to run 6 stories over that half an hour news program, you're going to make decisions about which 6 stories to run. If you have a podcast, you're going to make a decision about the topic of the podcast, the guest you're going to invite on, the topics you're going to talk about. But in the whole other world that we think a lot about is that these kind of decisions about what information to show people on social media platforms, these are not being made by individual producers. These are being made by algorithms. And I think that becomes one of the big questions is what are the algorithms prioritizing in terms of what they make available to people? And in that regard, I think we're in a kind of very interesting new world in the kind of what I would call the TikTokification of social media world that we find ourselves in today.
I have a question about all of this, which is it makes me think of the research that I think maybe was more about legacy media in political science that came to the conclusion or the argument that the media doesn't tell you what to think, it tells you what to think about. Is that still true in the age of TikTokification, which I want to talk more about?
I think, as you go, again, if you take the comparison to be back in the 60s and 70s, where we had these sort of 3 national news shows that were on every night, that was very much a lot of these are the things that we're going to talk about. And we're going to try to give you a good faith, straight and down the narrow, not opinionated. As we get into a world of cable network news, where we start to have the Fox News and the MSNBCs, it becomes clear that there's plenty of what's going on is trying to tell people what to think about issues, not just trying to tell people how to think about issues, not just what to think about issues. And now as we move into a broader world where you have, especially the younger generation, is much less likely to be getting their news from actual scripted news programs and instead are sort of scrolling all over the place. And especially with this rise of short form video and the rise of the influencer culture, you're going to have even more people who are telling you both what to think about and how to think about it. So I think those are, I think the maybe at the base level, there is a spectrum between opinion and news, right? And that's a better way to think of it is like, where do different types of programs and different types of sources of news fall on that spectrum between opinion and news? And they all kind of fall somewhere.
So when we think about misinformation, and I'll leave it to you to help us understand whether we're talking about misinformation or hyperpartisan content, do we have any idea how much is out there? I think the default assumption and the way that I see it talked about online is misinformation is everywhere. It's a massive problem. It's like a problem of our time. We need to fact check. We need to correct. How do you think about actually figuring out how much is out there?
Yeah, so there's a phenomenal piece that appeared in PNAS or Science Advances by my colleague Jenny Allen, from NYU Stern School of Business, who's now at NYU, but she did this when she was working with a team at Penn, where they actually measured misinformation. And and what they did is they compared it to how much information people were consuming on television that was not news related, how much they were consuming online that was not news related, then how much was news related, and it gets smaller on TV, how much was news related online, it gets smaller, and then how much of that is misinformation. And they did this with actual tracking data of people's browsing behavior, and the misinformation component of it is tiny. And here's the response that I would give when people say the norm is that misinformation is everywhere, is go to your own social media feed and literally scroll back the last 50 posts that show up in your social media feed, and then come back and tell me how many of those you think were abject misinformation. Right. And so the reality of the situation is one of the big things that we've learned as academics is that so much on the internet is guided by power laws. And a power law is these kind of distributions that look like this kind of a shape. And what they basically mean in a lot of things on the internet is that the vast majority of people are having almost no experience with something. And then small numbers of people are having larger, and correspondingly smaller groups of people are having even larger experiences. So we did this work at the Center for Social Media and Politics, where we looked at exposure to Russian trolls on Twitter in the 2016 elections. And we had a panel survey data, and we had people's Twitter handles. So we actually were able to estimate, and at that point it was pre-TikTokification. So we had the feed that people were seeing was coming through their social graph, people who they followed online. And so we had collected tweets from everybody they followed, which included all the tweets from those people and everyone those people had retweeted. So we actually knew for the people in our survey how many tweets from Russian trolls they could have been exposed to in their feed because someone they were following either retweeted one or shared one or retweeted someone who had shared it. What we found was that 1% of the people in that sample accounted for 90% of the exposures. And 10% of the people accounted for 99.5% of the potential exposures. So 90% of the people accounted for almost none of the exposures. So when we say that there's not a lot of misinformation out there, what we're saying is that on average, most people are encountering a small proportion of their feed to be misinformation that they're finding on social media. It doesn't mean that there aren't some people. And remember, on social media, when you got a couple 100 million people using a platform, even 0.5% is a million people. Some people are getting a lot more exposure to this, but lots of people are getting very minimal levels of exposure. And so that then leads to the question of what has been the consequences of all of this attention to the importance of fact checking, the importance of being aware of misinformation.
It does certainly seem, and tell me if this is reasonable, that there's, while it may be a small percentage, it does seem to have an outsized effect. We also know, correct me if I'm wrong, that misinformation tends to spread faster and wider than correct information, partly because misinformation, I think, is designed to be attention grabbing or to, whatever, push our ideological buttons. And it certainly seems like half the country believes the wrong thing about stuff. So, I'm sure everyone feels that way, maybe just not the same half of the country. So I think, I hear what you're saying, but it does seem to me that does not capture the full effect of misinformation. It could be having an outsized effect, even though it's limited to 10% of people. Most everyone else is watching cat videos, I guess, or whatever. They're just not getting directly
They're watching this
exposed to
podcast,
misinformation.
Steve.
Or is that just diluting out the misinformation?
So I think you're conflating a couple of different phenomena here, which are important. So like one is for the average person on the internet, what proportion of their stories are they seeing that contain misinformation? And that ends up being quite low.
Yeah.
Right. But that's a second question there's another question, which is the speed at which this information, kind of information spreads. And I think that there is research that showed, there was some very famous research that showed that misinformation spreads much faster than not misinformation. But again, when you're comparing one story to one story, you've got to remember there's much, much more on the true information that is what most people are encountering most of the time than there is on the misinformation side of things. So to get at the impact of this really requires, I think in many ways, it requires experimental research, which actually tries to measure the impact of being exposed to this kind of misinformation. Now, again, I want to really stress the power law nature of this. Because what we do find over and over again on the internet, and we have found this with misinformation, of course, is that there are these super spreaders and there are people that are just much more exposed to this information. And how these smaller groups of people who have higher levels of exposure, the big question is that selective exposure because they opt into these kind of communities? Is it algorithmic exposure because the algorithm kind of figures out that they sort of like these things and begins to show more of it to them? Now, the second question, though, that you brought up about this question about it just feels like half the people believe these things out here. This really brings in the role of elites and brings in the role of partisanship. Because there are all sorts of kind of rumors online and misinformation out there about minutia little things that we wouldn't think twice about. But things like anti-vax, climate skepticism, right? What ends up happening is that these become politically powerful ideas. And to the extent that, as a political scientist, as Andrea and I are, like, to the extent that this gets associated with a partisan identity, you can see a larger uptake in ideas around these things. So one of the interesting things about the anti-vax community, and I'm not an expert on this at all, but prior to COVID, the anti-vax community was one of these interesting kind of areas of online where actually it wasn't uniformly associated with a particular part of society. There were people on the left and people on the right who are anti-vax. Now, in the aftermath of COVID, you still see a little bit of that, and there are still some left-wing communities which are kind of a legacy of before, but it's gotten much more integrated into being kind of more right-wing and in particular more MAGA doctrine to be anti-vax. And that's when you can see that's when I would suggest that you see these big uptake of ideas. And then the final thing I would say is that, like, if we look at this Alan et al. Piece, I just think these are useful correctives to try to look at these things at scale, because your experience, you go online and you getting lots of people who are attacking you who've been exposed to these kinds of ideas online, it can feel like it's everybody. But that still it doesn't mean that it's actually large portions of the population who are involved with this.
Well, so I think this is such a helpful point, and I think it brings us to something that you and I have talked about separately that has really stuck with me, which is what are the consequences both of misinformation and I think the perceptions of misinformation. And it's something that you have really talked about thoughtfully, and I wondered if you could share the first order and second order consequences of misinformation.
Sure. And I think what's important, we'll have this conversation. I'll address your point, Andrea, in terms of misinformation. But I think what's crucially important is the exact same dynamic is playing out around AI and AI generated content right now. So when we think about both misinformation and we think about AI and AI generated content, we can think about the first concern that we think about, which I've called this like level 1 concern, which is, do people believe things that aren't true to be true? That's what we mainly focus on. That's what we got collectively as a country completely freaked out about in the aftermath of the 2016 US elections. And everybody began to think about, all right, what are the ways that we can prevent people from believing that things that are not true are actually true? And we got all this research on all sorts of different interventions and all sorts of different types of experiments. And we can think about that at the individual level, at the educational level, at the platform level. But there's a second order concern, right? If the first order concern is believing things that aren't true to be true, there's a second order concern, which is that does it become harder to convince people that things that are true are actually true? And this actually has a term which is called the liar's dividend, which is that if you create enough uncertainty about things being true, then when people are confronted with things that they have done or that they've said that they don't like, they just claim that they didn't actually happen. That's why it's called the liar's dividend, because if you begin to hear that everything is misinformation, right? Then when somebody comes along and says, oh, so-and-so said this, and the other person says, nope, that's just fake news. That didn't actually happen. You're primed to be a little skeptical of it. This is exactly what I fear is playing out with AI all over the time. We're getting all these warnings about images being generated, that things can be fake. They can be fake images. They can be fake videos. And those are serious concerns. The first order concerns are people going to believe these fake images and fake videos to be real? But I think we have to keep our mind on the second order concern, which is, are we going to get into a world where it becomes impossible to convince anybody that anything is real? And what does that do for accountability in our political system?
So, Josh, I have a question. So, trying to pull this all together, and I do think like the AI piece just makes it way more complicated, is that, I know it's easier in research to focus on one measurable thing. But what I see out there in the world, and every day I'm interacting with people of all sorts of beliefs, is that it's their total information ecosystem that is having a net effect, not misinformation or algorithms or online or legacy. It's the totality of their information ecosystem in the context of their dominant narratives. Right, so they have a narrative way of understanding the world that is usually shared by their tribe, whatever that is. Maybe it's multiple different tribes, and the information ecosystem feeds into that by curating information, peppering in a little bit of misinformation, maybe a little bit of disinformation, some AI information, and it's algorithmic. It's all those things at once, and it just it distorts their view of reality in a consistent direction. How do you measure that? I mean, first of all, do you agree that that's the kind of thing that's going on? And how is that experimentally measurable?
It's a great question. And it was actually, I was just smiling because it was related to the first midterm question I gave my undergraduates, but I'll be handing back their midterm later today. Because the story, essentially around social media causing political polarization, which is kind of what you're getting at here, is that it flows through putting people into echo chambers where they're surrounded by like-minded people and filter bubbles where they only see kind of like-minded content. And that mix in a little bit of misinformation, mix in some hyper-partisan content, mix in some degradation of people on the other side. That then is hypothesized to fuel increases in political polarization, whether it's issue-based polarization, people having more extreme issues, or it's affective polarization, people disliking supporters of the other side more. You raise a great point, Steve, though, which is that the vast majority of the academic research to date has focused on people's experiences on a single platform. And You are absolutely correct. And we've known this as scholars for a long time, that people live in complicated information environments. We did some research at the Center for Social Media and Politics at NYU, where we looked at people's sort of echo chamberness on Twitter, but we also surveyed them about what they were watching on television. So we found there were all these conservatives who didn't follow any media sources on Twitter that were to the left of Fox News, but they were watching like the local CBS News on TV, right? And so what does that mean for people being, does it mean they're in an echo chamber and a filter bubble? Does it not mean that they're in an echo chamber or a filter bubble? And I would argue that we often tended to think about this as legacy media. So people like, what kind of things are people in on cable news versus, you know, legacy media sources like the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal versus what was happening to people on social media platforms. But even that social media platform part of it has become much more diverse in the last couple of years, because we've seen first the wholesale explosion of TikTok, but we've also seen other platforms that have kind of blue sky, and you've got Truth Social, and you've got Gab, and you've got, you know, other platforms that are sort of, people are even getting, you know, you could almost justify 6 years ago being like, all right, Twitter, that's where the politics is. And if only we could get access to Facebook data, we could tell you some more stuff about Facebook too. But now it's getting much more complicated, and you have these different modes of information coming across people. So there's short form video, short form vertical video, there's long form video, there's memes, there's text. And so I think you're absolutely right. And I think it is a real challenge to the research community to really begin to think about how we characterize people's full scale information environments. And I think the story you tell about a narrative that people take from source to source and it gets either confirmed or disconfirmed in different cases, it probably has a great degree of validity to it, but it's so hard to do research in this regard. So we don't have I don't have like great studies I can talk to you about.
I mean, even this, and this isn't speaking to the full holistic picture, but I'm thinking now, Josh, of the studies that you or others at the Center for Social Media and Politics have done, where they got voters to agree to not go on Facebook for 6 weeks ahead of an election. And that's obviously, we don't know what news they're getting, who they're talking to, and other sorts of things. But that does seem to make a difference if you just sort of shut down wholesale, as opposed to manipulating, are you seeing this kind of post or that kind of post? It's like, just go off the platform.
Yeah, actually, though, I mean, it's so funny. I prepared a slide for this for teaching recently. So I went through all of the different studies. And so there have been a bunch of deactivation studies. We've done them at CSMAP. We did one in Bosnia. We did one in Cyprus. And then we did a WhatsApp deactivation study in Brazil. Well, not quite deactivation, but we reduced people's exposure to images and videos on WhatsApp. And then we just replicated that in Brazil and South Africa and India. There's a team out of Georgetown that has done one in the US and one in France. And then there's a team at Stanford that did one in the US. And we just did one as part of this US 2020 Facebook and Instagram election study, which was this big collaboration between a team of academics, 17 academics across a variety of different universities in the U.S. working with meta researchers to implement and design a series of studies during the U.S. 2020 elections, that I had the incredible privilege of being one of the co-chairs of the academic team for this. And we did a deactivation study as part of that. When you line them all up, basically, most of them have null effects. There's the one study we did in Bosnia that showed going off Facebook actually increased levels of ethnic polarization during the Srebrenica genocide commemoration, or Srebrenica massacre commemoration in Bosnia. And then there are a couple of studies that have pointed in the direction a little bit. The first one of these deactivation studies done in the US showed that it reduced levels of issue polarization a little bit. And then the most recent one from the US 2020, we don't find any statistically, now we're going to go in the weeds for a second here, Steve. We pre-registered to do multiple hypothesis correction, which, just for audiences that sounds like gibberish too. The way you prevent academics and researchers from cherry picking results of experiments is you do something called pre-registration, which is you commit ahead of time to how you're going to do the analysis. And then, and so anyway, when we did all the things that we committed to doing, it didn't hit conventional levels of statistical significance. But there was some indication that it was sort of in the direction. But across all these studies, the full deactivations on polarization doesn't seem to have an impact.
So I wonder if those of us who are concerned about people believing things that are true and not believing things that are not true, if we should be focusing more on promoting critical thinking skills rather than combating misinformation. it seems like if it's already kind of in the margins and having an outsized effect, maybe it's more of a problem with us, not a problem with the misinformation that's out there. You think that's a reasonable conclusion?
I think where I would land is to just say, I think we need to think carefully about this trade-off between the level 1 concerns and the level 2 concerns, right? And that we tend to be overly fixated on the level 1 concerns,
meaning like specific pieces of misinformation.
We are the level 1 concern. When I say so, first order concerns. Sorry, so level order. Yeah. First order concerns are: do you believe things that are not real to be real? Do you believe things that are false to be true? Right. That was the big fear. Misinformation. People are going to think it's true. Now we're having that conversation around AI, generative AI images. People are going to think they're real. Those are the first order concerns. I think they get a lot of attention. And at some level of attention, it exacerbates the second order concerns, which is that will people believe things that are actually real to be real because they keep hearing so much about how everything out there is fake. So I think we need to think about those trade-offs, and we need more research that helps us understand those trade-offs.
So what are the things that you think about as you watch current events unfold and you watch all of us, really focus on mostly the first order concern, I think both with generative AI and with the misinformation? Right. Like what is the change you wish to see in the world besides coming on our show and talking about how the second order concern is really serious?
Yeah, I mean, so I think we haven't quite talked about the elephant in the room here, which is the other issue about becoming so focused on addressing misinformation is that it got completely politicized.
Yeah.
And I would love to share just to take a second here about like, this was a train wreck. And Andrea, you and I have talked about this for years. This was a potential train wreck that we could see coming because if we think about this from a sort of for a first principle standpoint, when you say to someone, what do you think a biased enforcement policy around misinformation or an unbiased enforcement policy around misinformation would be? The normal response is going to be, well, it probably is removing about 50% Republican leaning content and 50% leaning Democratic content. Because we have this idea in our heads of what it means to be not biased is that it means to be fair, right, across the two. But any situation that you get when there's an asymmetry in the production of content that violates content moderation rules is going to diverge from this 50-50. So if you get lucky and you happen to live in a world where actually 50% of the content violating or equal amounts of the content violating content moderation policies is seen as being favoring one side of the political spectrum versus the other side of the political spectrum, then you can have content moderation in a way that doesn't feel to ordinary people like it is politically biased. However, if you live in a world where the content that violates these kind of content moderation rules, so let's say it's around anti-vax, for example, if you are during a pandemic and you're trying to, you're going to say, all right, we're going to take down content that is, that is questioning the efficacy of vaccines, right? If that is disproportionately being produced by one side of the political spectrum, and as opposed to the other side of the political spectrum, then the content moderation policy itself is going to be, let's say it's 80% is coming from the left and 20% is coming from the right. Then a policy that's not politically biased, that doesn't actually take account of the political leanings of the content, is really going to remove 80% of the content from the left and 20% of the content from the right. But that's going to look to people who think not biased is 50-50, like it is being picking on one side or the other. So you come back to the question of like, if I could wave my magic wand and I could get one thing, I mean, I'm going to go with the academic-y answer to this. What I want, and I have been writing about this for 8 years, so there's a long track record of this. What I want is more transparency, right? We live in a world where so much of our information environment is being controlled by a small handful of very, very powerful companies. Now, we saw this in social media. We're replicating it again in the world of large language models and chatbots and AI and these kinds of things. We need transparency about what's happening on these platforms, which means we need vehicles to getting data access to those who are outside of the companies so that I can come on these kind of podcasts and talk to you about what we're finding in these kinds of studies.
Right. Yeah, that seems reasonable. But that's kind of what I was getting at before, too, is that well, maybe we should focus more on just making people more media savvy and having better critical thinking skills rather than trying to protect them from misinformation, because there is this sort of catch-22. Not only it's going to be politicized, which it absolutely has been. Any metric you come up with to measure the quality of information then gets attacked as being political or gets hacked and gamed. And so it seems like an unwinnable kind of war. Plus, if you actually did do that, aren't governments then just going to take control of it and put their thumb on the scale? And now it becomes just a mechanism of the government's controlling our information, which is, in my opinion, is the worst case scenario. So if I can wave my skeptical magic wand, it would be, can't we just teach people to be better critical thinkers and be more media savvy? And that is really the only long-term solution.
Yeah, Steve. So I'm very sympathetic to that. And actually, you heard Andrea chuckling a little bit here. My background is in Russian and East European politics, and I spent 20 years studying mass political behavior in post-communist countries before I got into studying digital media and politics. And I often have found myself, I think, a little bit on one of the extremes of the research community here, because I am quite worried as you state here about giving too much power to states to decide these things. And I would get questions from journalists in 2017, 2018 asking me, well, why don't they just kick Donald Trump off the platforms? And I would say, well, would you ask me the same question if Donald Trump Jr. was installed as the head of Facebook tomorrow? Because that's kind of what happened in Russia, right? Like they had a platform, Vkontakte, they chased out the founder of it. They put a Kremlin ally in charge of it. And so I do think actually, given the long conversation we just had a moment ago about how this has become so politicized in this country, that there is a lot of energy going to, okay, what are things that we can do to try to improve the information environment that don't have to put people in this difficult position of being the arbiters of truth, right? That was the big line that Mark Zuckerberg would say over and over again, like Facebook doesn't want to be the arbiters of truth. And you could argue it was self-serving for the company, but that doesn't mean it's not true also, right? These things can both be held at the same time. And so I do agree that we want to think about making people better consumers of information. And I think there's some reason to be in some ways optimistic on that, because I do think one of the things that's happened, and we still haven't, we have yet to see the long-term cumulative effects of this, but that there has been a big push to add digital literacy education to people's undergraduate, to people's high school curriculum, to their middle school curriculum, right? My wife teaches middle school, and she teaches her 8th grade history students how to think about sources and how to think about interacting with digital online. And there's lots of curricula online to sort of help teachers be able to do this. And so I do think there is important things going in that direction. But if I may add a caveat to that, right? We had this famous first article, one of the famous earliest pieces on sharing false information. And what we found was that in the 2016 elections is that older people age 65 and older, were shared on average 7 times as many links to these false news websites as the 18 to 29-year-olds. And so that was at a time where everyone was like, social media, it's all the kids, they're causing all the problem, right? And I do think, and going back to AI in a second, there was a piece, I think it was in The Economist, maybe the New York Times in the last couple of days, but just about the number of hours that older adults, and especially older adults living by themselves, some who have health ailments that make it harder for them to go out and be able to do things, they're just spending increasingly large amounts of time on screens. And so when we think about this digital literacy, I think we really need to think, especially as we're getting into all the AI questions, we need to think holistically about this. In a sense, integrating things into the curriculum for students is the low-hanging fruit. It's how you reach the rest of the population. I think that's the...
Now that you guys have magic wands, if I could have a magic wand, I would add data literacy to all of this, whether digital or otherwise. But Josh, just as a final question, how concerned, part of the reason we're doing this show is because a lot of us are very concerned about what's going on in the country and the world politically. Like, you're someone who's in the weeds, in the thick of studying this aspect of what's going on in the United States and the world. How generally concerned are you? I don't know if this is a personal question. Like, how are you concerned, or are you like, no, we're going to figure this out? Like, where do you land on the concern optimism matrix, let's say?
I continue to be very interested in understanding the consequences of the digital information environment for politics. And that is something that evolves all the time. I am also aware that we are living in a particularly volatile moment that has come out of the pandemic, where globally we have seen voters rebelling against governments across the board, all over the world, in places where, in 2024, parties that never lose elections, like the ANC in South Africa and the LDP in Japan, both lost controls of their majority, right? In Iran, which doesn't even have free or fair elections, the preferred candidate of the incumbent lost. And that this has it added a great degree of volatility. I'm also quite concerned about what's happening in the United States, that we are living through a period of time where we are beginning to learn that a great deal of what we thought preserved democracy in this country coming from institutions was actually based on norms. And that we are seeing what happens when those norms are not respected by those who are in power. And I think it's teaching us something crucially important about the nature of this, incredibly long-standing democracy that we all live in. I am optimistic that one of the things we will learn from this is the importance of not just relying on norms and actually building things into institutions. And that brings us back to this question of the information environment and thinking about the kind of information environment that we want to have, but also the political consequences of decisions that we make about the kind of information environment that we want to have. I think it's crucially important to understand this, to illustrate this distinction between the hard work of training people to be digitally literate and kind of shortcuts. We ran a series of studies at our center that looked at what happened when people were encouraged to search online when they were trying to figure out whether a news story was true or not. So trying to assess the veracity of a news story. And we ran a series of studies varying the context in which people did this. And the reason we did this is because in all these sort of digital literacy tips, you will see things that says, if you're not sure if something is true, seek out additional information on it. Now, these things will say, seek out additional information from a high quality source. Go online and look for other sources of this. But what we found over and over again in these studies, that was that when people went and used search engines to go online and try to figure out if news stories were true or not, they actually became more likely to believe that false news stories were true. And we saw this in study after study after study. And so one of the big questions that comes out of this is, if you're doing digital literacy training, right? And what all that people remember from it is Google something. That actually has a countervailing effect. It makes people more likely to believe that these false news stories are true. And we are replicating this right now by looking at what happens when people go to AI to try to figure out whether news stories are true or not. And our initial set of results is that AI is not as bad as search, but it's still not having the positive impact of making people actually more likely to believe that false news stories are indeed false. Moreover, we find this really interesting finding, which is that you're more we think that the reason this is being driven by in search is that it's being driven by cases where people get other low quality news sources back in their search. And we found in the search engine studies that if you did what we called lazy searching, which was like just cutting and pasting the URL or just cutting and pasting the headline, it made it much more likely that you were going to get back these low quality sources in your list of things that Google returned, which makes sense if you think about the economics of the low quality news ecosystem. But what we found when we did it with AI is that actually, if you cut and pasted the news article title or the URL into AI, you actually got better information back, and people did better on that. So that's what I said. Like, it's a lot of nuance. It's a lot of things that are complicated here, but not everything that sounds good is good. And so I think it's really important with these digital literacy things for us to not just think about the things that we think are going to help people do a better job, as you say, Steve, of navigating the information environment, but actually test these things empirically, but also see how people respond to these actual instructions. Right.
So that fits completely with what we find in the skeptical community, where, again, it's not just digital literacy, it's critical thinking. And one critical thinking lesson that we learned, just, from the literature and from our experience is that people have a psychological tendency to confirm their belief, right? So when they are researching, if you shouldn't be researching to show that it's true, because that's what people will do by default. You have to consciously research to show it's not true. As you say, I don't believe something until I've thoroughly researched who believes it's not true and why. And so I think you have to couple it. You can tell me what you think about that, but you have to couple the search other resources with, you should be trying to disprove this. And it only holds up if you can't disprove it. If you try to find out that it's true, that's what you will find.
If you just look at the top 5 Google hits for why is this the case, that's not going to get you there.
And now imagine you're entering into a world where people are going to try to do this with AI.
Yeah.
And imagine a world where AI is sycophantic
Yes.
and wants to make you feel good about yourself.
I've already been tricked by this. I consider myself a critical thinker, and
you have to
you have to prompt carefully.
We talk about this too, like when you're doing a Google search, I always do comma skeptical. Like I want you to tell me this is wrong. Or when you're doing an AI prompt, you have to push back against the AI. Say, isn't this not true? Or who doesn't believe in this? And then they come around very quickly because they're trying to please you.
Right.
But if you just and I've had people say, I asked ChatGPT and it told me this misinformation. It's like, well, how did you were asking for misinformation and that's what you got.
Right.
And so that becomes, this is why we wanted to replicate this study. So the original study appeared in Nature about a year and a half ago, but we've just finished running these replication studies where we've replicated the Google search, but also added this AI search version of it, because this is exactly what we're trying to get at, right? Like, is AI better because it can rely on higher quality sources? But what happens, how are people going to interact? How do they use it? And we can think of all these different ways. So I think it's an incredibly fruitful area for research going forward, but also I think for those who are concerned about, informing their listeners about, healthy information environment hygiene, right? It's really important to understand how humans actually interact with these things as opposed to how we think they should.
Well, Josh, we'll have to have you back on when that paper comes out to talk further about it. Where can people keep up with your work?
They can find csmapnyu.org. That's csmapnyu.org. You can also just Google me.
Yeah.
But csmapnyu.org is where you're going to find links to all of the, lots of these studies that we talked about over the course of today's podcast.
Yeah, and we'll definitely Google and ask AI, why is Joshua Tucker definitely correct and never wrong? So that will be how we find you. All right. Well, thanks very much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on.
Of course.
Thanks so much, and love to come back and talk more. This was great.
Awesome. We'll have you back for sure.
Take
All right.
care.
Okay.
Bye. See you soon. And to close, we're going to zoom in on another segment called Politics is Local. Steve, today, at the time of this recording, is Election Day.
That's right.
In Connecticut, New York, and a lot of parts around the United States. Did you vote today?
I didn't vote today. I voted early.
Nice.
I voted a few days ago.
Who'd you vote for? Let's hear it.
So that's personal. Thank you. But this is an off year election, and this is where the very, very low voter turnout. But that means you have more of an impact when you do vote
That's right.
in these elections. And there are always, I say politics is local. Like, I voted for my town's mayor, and my wife and I were having a conversation about this. Like, who our mayor is probably has a greater effect on our lives than who the president is. Most administrations, or I think governor, like,
in an ideal world, maybe?
Where's the peak effect? We thought maybe the peak effect might be governor, but still mayors have an outsized effect on your life. You should take those elections seriously, like actually figure out what they want to do. And as we discussed in a previous episode, the choice was pretty standard. It was pretty standard. Conservative wants to lower taxes, Democrat who wants to invest more in infrastructure, and then there was a progressive independent running as well. So we took the time to learn what their views were and vote. And then also the other local election was, again, this is something that you may not think is worth your time and effort, but it absolutely is, was the school board. Because, school boards can have a massive influence on the education that your children receive, that, our kids are out of school now, but even still, we care about the world and our country. So those local positions have an outside effect. They're worth your time and attention on these off-year elections.
And it really is too bad that there are not enough There's not nearly as much energy around these local
Yeah.
elections, even though they, as you said, really do impact us. So I'm in New York City, and I don't know if you heard.
Is there a mayor election happening?
There's a kind of a normal run-of-the-mill election that is not noteworthy. I was actually in Brazil a week or two ago, and they said, "So tell us about Mamdani." And I was like, "Wow,
Wow.
all local politics is global in the New York City mayoral race." So I actually will be voting after this, so there's still time to change my mind if anyone wants to get into it. But one of the things that we'll be voting for, in addition to the high-profile mayor race, is a change in when we hold elections. And there's a movement to move the elections, these local elections, to more typical election year
Yeah, so
timings.
it's not an off year.
So it's not off year. So our big elections would be at the same time that you have the House elections and things like that, in part to get more interest. And so
Yeah,
I think
that
those
makes sense.
those sorts of local changes can really make a difference.
And there's a very local election happening in California that has national implications. It's a Prop 50 about should we suspend the rules on gerrymandering so we could gerrymander the hell out of California and counteract some of the gerrymandering that's happening in a lot of red states. How do you feel about that?
Well, I feel like we should have a much bigger conversation
Yeah.
about gerrymandering. What do you think?
Absolutely. That's definitely an upcoming episode, and we'll have the results of this election to talk about at the time. But it is, it's an interesting controversy over whether this is a good idea or not.
And I think it goes back to this kind of like, are we trying to there are two ways to win the game of politics. One is to win given the rules as they are, and the other is to change the rules. I personally would put gerrymandering under changing the rules, but there's certainly arguments that say, no, we're reflecting the changes in the population. So we'll get into all of that in a future episode.
All right. So we'll see you next time.